food, agriculture, what we eat is a big piece of the challenge that you see all around us here of climate change. And we're really pleased to have a wonderful group of discussants to look at this question and what we can do about it. We're very happy also to have here to kick this off former Senator Larry Pressler, who was senator from South Dakota, grew up on a farm as a young man, went off to Vietnam, became a congressman, became a senator. And I think what's interesting about his experience is that he was of that world before, grew up anyway in that world, before we had any notion of climate change, any sense of the challenges that it was going to pose. And people in agriculture were rather just doing their farming and not concerned with the ways in which it played into the larger sort of cosmic question of the atmosphere and all the attendant effects that you know about. So, Senator Pressler, please come up and maybe share your thoughts with us. And Senator Pressler will then introduce our panelists. We're sorry for the water streaming in, but perhaps it is a reminder that we live in a world where what happens in the weather affects all of us in one way or another. Senator Pressler, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm here today with an old friend of mine of 54 years, Jerry Dodson, who is a strong backer of the Asia Society. And so, Jerry, very nice to see you again. He was in Vietnam at the same time. And in Vietnam, I did 2 tours there. I did 1 tour, and then you can get a special job if you come back for a second tour. And my special job was part of the USAID, where they went into areas with fertilizer and seeds where the USAID people couldn't go because it was a little too dangerous. So the U.S. military did have some very good projects in Vietnam, and it was the first time in my life I thought we were winning until the Tet Offensive, but that's all ancient history. But I'm really glad to see all of you here concerned about the environment, and it's really hard to make much progress with the amount of coal and oil that is still burned. Now, in agriculture, that has come to, they're burning less oil because of the minimum tillage. That's the word I'm looking for. Minimum tillage. They don't turn the ground, plow it over anymore. They just do minimum tillage. So that's saved a lot of gases from going into the air by farm tractors not needing as much oil or gas. So every part has to do our best. Of course, they say that anybody who flies in a jet airplane cannot call themselves an environmentalist, although most of them do. But I've been working on issues involving the environment for all my life, and so that's why I'm so glad to see so many of you here today. As mentioned, I was raised on a family farm in Humboldt, South Dakota, where I helped my father to grow corn and soybeans. It is thought that cattle feeding is one of the big problems, but we like to eat a lot of meat, and so long as that's the case, we're going to need beef for food. As we've seen in many parts of our country, droughts and flood have had disastrous effects on the environment. This has disrupted the operation of small farmers all across America. I'm also concerned about the impact that global warming could have on the world's glaciers. And I wish that some of these were identified more. I'm always making suggestions about how I could do something better, but I couldn't. But the picture you have up are just wonderful. And I guess it does tell somewhere where these are located. For example, if the Earth continues to warm at its current trajectory, the glaciers of the Tibetan Plateau, which feed some of the major rivers in Asia, such as the Yellow River, the Mekong River, will be threatened. This could ruin the farmland of countries all throughout Asia, which would be disastrous for international stability. There are some innovations which have come online, but none of them have really solved our problem. But we can all make a contribution by, I guess we're burning some fuel right there. Now we have a very interesting panel. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Johanna Chao Kreilick, who's president of the Union of Concerned Scientists. Corby Kummer, executive director for Food and Safety. Ricardo Salvador, director of Food and Environment at the Union for Concerned Scientists. And Alice Waters, founder of Chez, Panisse. If they would come up here and sit down, please.
Thank you, Senator Pressler, and welcome everyone. My name is Johanna Chao Kreilick, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you today. I want to extend just a huge debt of appreciation to all the people who helped bring the Coal and Ice exhibit, its powerful images and messages to so many people around the world, including us today. And I also today want to give a special shout out to a couple of people whose leadership was really instrumental in helping us create today's conversation on food and culture and the climate crisis. Orville Schell, Nancy Stevens, Rachel Rosado, and Leah Thompson. Thank you so much for your work. So as president of the Union of Concerned Scientists, I'm immersed every day in the fight for climate justice. But it's a really huge privilege to be up here on this stage with these extraordinary visionary leaders and all of you to talk about the issues of food, which are so fundamental and intersectional with everything that you see around you. Before engaging with each of our speakers on 2 questions, after which I expect we'll have some time to hear questions from all of you, and I really do want to invite anybody who's interested in making a comment or asking a question to come up to one of these 2 mics after our panelists have had a chance to speak. But I want to set the table, the metaphorical table a little bit here, with just a little bit of grounding of facts and data on our food system here in the United States. At the Union of Concerned Scientists, I work with a number of extraordinary colleagues who are putting people-centered science at the heart of policies that deliver healthy food for everyone. And we do that work for the same reasons expressed in the title of this panel. Because our food system here in the United States, and frankly around the world, is in crisis. And food gives us a really tangible way to talk about what's at stake for all of us in the face of the climate crisis. So even if you don't live in a flood zone, haven't been evacuated because of a wildfire or a hurricane, you do sit down at your table every day, and each and every single one of us depends on food. My colleagues are working right now on science-based policy solutions for California's Central Valley, which is a massive interior region comprising 20 counties, 35,000 farms, and 6 million acres that produce the country's food for 25% of its food supply. And in the Central Valley and beyond, climate change is already dramatically impacting the soil and water conditions and the people at the heart of our food systems, including farmers and food workers. In some parts of the Central Valley, large agribusiness has drawn down water supplies to record lows, leaving the local communities dependent upon bottled water to drink and to bathe in. Runoff from chemical fertilizers pollutes the remaining surface water, and emissions from industrial agricultural machinery pollutes the air, making the Central Valley some of the most polluted communities in the country. While business as usual generates huge profits for big agriculture, the people working on these farms and in these systems do not share in the bounty. Many Central Valley farm workers are undocumented, which makes them extra vulnerable to exploitation. The folks who put the salad, the orange juice, the pistachios on your table carry out extremely dangerous work for poverty wages, often in extreme heat, which is only intensifying as the climate crisis worsens. To make it worse, many farm and food workers do not themselves have access to fresh food or drinking water. So you can see, while the issue of food that we'll all be talking about today is also an issue of equity and inclusion and justice. And while other agricultural regions in the United States, and frankly around the world, face different challenges, the biggest challenges in the Central Valley are the same across our food system: poor water and soil management, air and water pollution, and deadly conditions for workers. There is some good news, however, and that is we have everything we need right now, right here, to feed everyone in this country, and in a way that is responsible, equitable, healthy, sustainable, and just. Science tells us that we already have all the knowledge, the technology that we need to scale up sustainable agricultural practices to meet nutritional needs while also reducing environmental impacts. So it's for this reason that I am so honored to introduce our panelists, who will take us into a conversation about our domestic and global food systems, what the challenges are, and what the solutions already are and can be. Each of our speakers today are incredibly passionate and tireless visionaries who've been looking ahead of the curve, thinking and acting outside of the box, and joining forces with others, including young leaders, their parents, teachers, educators, private sector allies, Black, brown, and indigenous farmers, media, movement coalitions, to catalyze truly systemic and inspirational change in our food systems and policies. I do want to give a little justice. I mean, I don't think these people need much introduction, but just bear with me while I just sketch a little bit more. They're not only incredible activists and advocates, they're writers, artists, thinkers, and doers in their own right. Corby Kummer, Executive Director of the Food and Society Policy Program at the Aspen Institute, where he brings together and convenes public health leaders, policymakers, researchers, farmers, chefs, food makers, and entrepreneurs to find practical solutions to food system challenges. Corby is also a senior lecturer at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science at Tufts University. And of course, he's a James Beard Award winner for his fabulous food writing and senior editor at The Atlantic. Last but not least, he's my neighbor in Jamaica Plain in Massachusetts. Alice Waters absolutely needs no introduction. Chef, author, food activist, James Beard Award winner, National Humanities Medal recipient, and founder of the incredible Chez Panisse restaurant in Berkeley, California. She has been a champion, a lifelong champion of local sustainable agriculture for decades, inspiring and enduring an inspirational movement. Alice is also the founder of the Edible Schoolyard Project, which I hope we'll hear about today, which uses organic school gardens, kitchens, and cafeterias to connect public school students and their families and teachers to food, nature, and frankly, critical thinking and democratic practice. Alice, your books were some of my earliest books in my family's and my mother's home, and I really, it's a real honor to be here with you. My incredible colleague, Dr. Ricardo Salvador, Senior Scientist and Director of the Food and Environment Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, has steered a team to help transition our current food system into one that produces healthy foods while also employing sustainable practices. I know you're also a huge champion of racial justice, Ricardo, and that you've married both of those in your advocacy, in your science, and in your science-based advocacy. In addition to your leadership and work at the Union of Concerned Scientists, Ricardo advises an impressive number of scientific advocacy and social justice organizations and philanthropies, including the National Academy of Sciences, the International Panel of Experts in Sustainable Food, the Land Institute, I could go on, the Heal Food Alliance, and many others. So I am now going to ask you each a set of questions. We'll start with the first question and do one run through. Take a second question, do another run through. And again, I really do invite each of you to participate with us. I really want this to be a two-way, multi-network, multi-nodal conversation. Questions are an act of courage, so please do not be shy. Starting with you, Corby, each of you brings incredibly deep experiences in the food movement. What is the most hopeful development you are seeing in this arena, especially as it relates to climate change?
Thank you very much. I'm among my betters today. Ricardo and Alice have inspired me throughout my career. What I'm inspired by is youth and young people. That's what I'm going to talk about. Two models I also want to mention are Carlo Petrini and the slow food movement have been very influential and informative to both Alice and me. And one of the key insights of Carlo and slow food were you cannot be a gastronome and care about food if you were not an environmentalist, understand the environment and what the impact of your food purchasing and your food behavior has on the environment. And he also pulled young people like a Pied Piper into this international movement. The second are the writings of Wendell Berry. And I do hope that everyone here will read Wendell Berry if they haven't, and you can start with a beautiful New Yorker profile of Wendell, so affectionate and so wonderful, by Dorothy Wickenden in a recent New Yorker about 2 weeks ago. So young people care more than any generation in my lifetime about the climate. This is what motivates them in school. It's what motivates them in the environment and forestry programs they choose. They choose their schools now based on commitment to climate. Alice is going to be telling us about what she's helping in education and climate. And so the idea that young people are strongly committed and want to make a difference is what I find most hopeful. Food and Society at the Aspen Institute has just launched applications for a new Food Leaders Fellowship. And we invite you all to invite young leaders who are already working within the food system to make change in sustainability and equity. I'm looking strongly at Ricardo because he ran a fellowship that has been my model. And if we can do half the job at forming tomorrow's leaders that Ricardo has done, we will be well on our way. And we'll invite you all. Food Leaders Aspen, you'll find it on the web. That's kind of enough for me. The commitment of young people, their personal belief they need to make a change by their daily actions and what they eat is what I find most inspiring.
Super. Turning to you, Alice.
Turning to me. I'm holding a baguette because I was given this baguette when I went to a wonderful bakery this morning called Chez. I didn't know about that bakery, but the person who's running it is using all regenerative organic flour. I went to it for that reason, because I wanted to taste the bread. But he just gave me this loaf, and it reminded me of when I first went to Paris. I was 19, and I felt like I'd never eaten before that time. But I would stand with everybody in line to get a hot baguette. And I wondered how people over the years were so patient to stand in line for a baguette. Well, I certainly found out one thing this morning, because it was hot out of the oven and I just held it close. And I thought, this is why they do it. But it's more than that. It's, of course, about taste. And the most hopeful idea that I have for climate is about taste. Because the only way to have ripe food is when you're eating completely, locally, and in season. And that is the truth. I started Chez Panisse 50 years ago, pretty much right after I got back from France, because I wanted to eat like the French. I wanted to eat that food. And it took me a long time to realize that it wasn't in and available, except maybe in some health food stores in the late 60s, but it didn't look like the French food. And I didn't want any of that organic supermarket food. So we ended up connecting with the local farmers. And that's how it all began, because we didn't have a middleman that was taking the money. We went right straight to the farm. And once the farmers and the ranchers and the fishers heard about Chez Panisse willing to buy the food at the real cost, they came to us. And pretty soon, within a year, we had a network of people that we bought from seasonally. Mas tomatoes, peaches in September and late August. And ultimately, we found a farm of our own. So we take all of the scraps from the food back to the farm an hour away and bring the vegetables to the restaurant. Well, I'm talking about this in a very serious way, because what it did for us and for the restaurant was to understand that the food we were serving was really good because of the people who grew it and who made it and who made the bread. And that was why. And they were all people who took care of the land. And it just happened that Bob Kennard, who was our major farmer, we didn't know about regenerative ag 40 years ago, but he was doing that. He was taking care of the soil. And when we went there the first time, you couldn't see any of the crops. There was almost a cover crop around everything, and you had to pull aside and pull up that carrot. And Bob Kennard said, my carrots are 15% more nutritious than anybody else's. And we laughed. And now he says they're 25%. And I do believe him. And the taste was so extraordinary. And that relationship has just really blossomed over the years. And I have a feeling that with the Edible Schoolyard project that I've been involved with for now 26 years with teenagers at a middle school in Berkeley, Martin Luther King Middle School, with 1,000 kids who speak 22 different languages at home. And what we did there, because of an enlightened principle, he just said, do it, Alice, whatever you'd like. And so we made a garden and a kitchen classroom, but not to teach cooking or gardening per se, but to teach all of the academic subjects. So when they were studying the country in the Middle East, they'd be cooking pita bread, and they'd be making hummus and greens and cooking the greens. And because they were doing it themselves, they all wanted to eat it. So I know one thing for sure: if they grow it and they cook it, they eat it. It's 6 weeks to kale. So this is a myth of the fast food industry. One, it's impossible to cook food that kids like. That's a myth. Number two, the myth that we can't afford to do it in the schools is wrong. We can. If we don't use too much meat or cheese, use them like most countries do as flavoring, then we can do that. And thirdly, that it's impossible in the situation of our schools to have a civilized lunch. And I just went to a school in Richmond, California, a very poor community. It's called the Michelle Obama School. And they had brought tables into the gymnasium, and they covered them with tablecloths. They put beautiful posters on the walls at lunchtime, and they had all organic food from local people that fit into the reimbursement of the USDA. And they served this beautiful breakfast, all the kids sitting down and eating together, and eating it all. So it's possible. And my dream, and I'll talk about it more, is school-supported agriculture.
So Alice, before I turn to Ricardo, I'll be right with you. I did want to ask you to share with the audience just a little bit more. You're a myth buster. You've just shown and shared that. You've also, I think, really helped to forge connections around food, around engagement of sort of critical thinking and learning and experience with educational institutions, cultural institutions, the museum in LA, and the wider university system. Can you tell the audience a little bit more about that project?
Yes. Well, I've been trying to think of the most effective way to make dramatic change. And I had the opportunity 2 years ago to speak with Janet Napolitano, who was the head of the president of the University of California system. And she has a climate neutrality initiative for 2025. And out in my backyard, we had lunch, and I said, Janet, is it possible that we could include food for the entire university? What if we had a procurement of only local regenerative organic food? And she looked at me and she said, I don't see why not. Maybe it would take a little bit more time to make it regenerative as well. And I was so shocked by that. And she was about to give her speech to the Board of Regents. And I said, Janet, would you say that at the Board of Regents? And she did. And I have it on tape. But most important about this was she wanted to introduce me to President Michael Drake. And he came over and we had lunch in my backyard, because I think that feeding people these ideas are the most important way to communicate what food is, how beautiful it is, how aromatic it is, how, in the garden to see it growing has been very, very successful and important for me. But Michael Drake embraced this idea. And over this last year and a half, we've been engaging all the campuses, and they are in process right now, both from Janet Napolitano's tenure, and I believe if they do this, it will make a path for K through 12. And the University of California, I know because I was there in the 60s, I know what can happen when they shout it out. And we felt we really helped to stop the war in Vietnam. We helped with civil rights. We definitely got free speech at the University of California. But that is what's so important to me, is to have a model that we can really replicate. And the more that this can happen across the country and around the world, the more likely we are going to be able to make that path for ourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Ricardo, you've really been a thought and action leader, both here on food in the United States, but truly globally. So I just want to encourage you to answer the question from a domestic and a global perspective. Very keen to hear what you see as some of the most hopeful and kind of forward-thinking developments in the transformation of food systems, especially as it relates to climate change and equity.
Thank you, Johanna. I think that we've all been inspired by what we've heard already, and what should give us hope is the moment in which we live in is showing all of us the urgency of transforming the food system here and around the world. Because the combination of the pandemic and the invasion and war on Ukraine have shown us that a feature of our food system is that it is extremely vulnerable to disruptions in a single place that ripple out and affect people all over the planet. And I'm really hopeful because that realization is spurring many people, including those of us who are advocates, but most importantly, the people that are in the food system and the people that are eating what the food system produces, to realize that they need to be active in transforming that food system. So living in a moment when the system appears to be breaking down, when we've all experienced empty shelves, when we've all experienced rising food prices, makes us realize that there needs to be a better way. And so it gives me hope to think that people will take action on those realizations. Now, I'd like to put this into context. I was really struck by comments made on introduction by Orville Schell and by Senator Pressler, who have the perspective of having lived a good chunk not only of the prior century, but of the transformation in global food systems. And it's really important to have that perspective, particularly of the changes that have happened since the Second World War, which is really the phase that coincides with the creation of the food system that most of us are familiar with now throughout the world, because the transformation that began in places like the United States and the European Union essentially has been taken throughout the entire planet. And the realization that these two gentlemen spurred for me was their observation that they did not used to think about climate change. Or Orville Schell said, we had no idea about the impact of the activities that we practice on the farm might result in. And the insight that follows from that is that while we think that we have a food system that is modern in every sense, in other words, we apply all of the latest technologies and continuously innovate, we produce a great deal of food. In fact, what has occurred is that we have applied 20th and 21st century technology to very old ways of thinking that tell us what needs to change. So it isn't just that we need to change practices, many of those need to change, but it is our values around the food system that need to be transformed. So let me tell you what I mean by that. It is that at the time of the founding of this country, just to give you a milestone that everyone will identify, 1776, there were 1 billion of us on this planet, 1/8 of today's population. So 1/8 of today's population could deforest, could send waste down the river, could erode soil without feeling like they were having a tremendous impact on the planet, because relative to the buffering capacity of ecosystems, the planet could absorb that erosion or that waste, the carbon dioxide that is being released by opening up grasslands. But if you multiply that not only by the impact of the technologies that we now apply, but by the huge demand that we create by luxury consumption, that's luxury consumption, then in fact we're exploiting the planet. And as we heard in the introduction, it isn't only that we're exploiting the planet, we're also exploiting people, as exemplified by the fact that many of the people that are actually responsible for doing the hard work in the agricultural system, this includes both farmers and farm workers, that have to think a year in advance at least, plan what they're going to plant, procure the seeds and the inputs that they're going to need, do the hard work of getting it into the ground during a very narrow window of time, make sure that the crops are cultivated, fertilized, and then go in there and harvest, process, in the case of livestock, hack away at carcasses, in the case of the retail food system, move massive amounts of food around the planet, transport it, package it, preserve it, deliver it on our shelves. There's a tremendous number of people that make all of that happen, and many of them are the people that don't earn enough to participate in the benefits of the system that would not be viable without them. Now that is the value. I don't need to remind anybody here that one of the most extreme ways in that value of exploitation was embodied was that it wasn't many generations ago that we actually enslaved people to do all of the menial and brutal work that we weren't willing to do ourselves. And it isn't like that has changed. If you've followed the news in the last couple of weeks, Congress just got around to actually passing a law outlawing lynching, which is a sad relic of the period of time where we had a set of people who we thought were less than to do work that we thought was less than. So a feature of the food system that needs to change is that it exploits people and nature, and then that will lead to a completely different set of practices. If it were not for the disruptions that we've all experienced recently, that would not be polite conversation. But these days, this is polite conversation. You can have this conversation in Capitol Hill. The conversations are happening about the need to practice agriculture in a totally different way, not just in the sense that we need to find climate-friendlier ways of producing our food, but also ways that do not exploit people, and more importantly, to make it up to the generations of people, not just the current generation of people that we're exploiting in order to have the, quote, modern food system, but the generations of people who were robbed of their livelihood, well-being, and future because of the fact that they were being exploited. That's polite conversation these days. The USDA just recently set up an equity commission whose task it is specifically to look into the future and say, what does the Department of Agriculture need to do differently from the era in which it thought that its mission was basically just to support the agribusiness sector and the sector of farmers who believed that they were just producing food by extracting. Now we know enough about the way that the planet works and about the way in which socioeconomics work, and we know that there are alternatives, that we need to apply that knowledge so that we're no longer applying 21st century technology to 18th century way of doing things, but 21st century technology to 21st century ways of doing things, which involve not exploiting people, not exploiting nature, building up and regenerating nature, and producing food in a way that provides dignified livelihood for everyone that's involved in producing and eating that food. That's what gives me hope.
Ricardo, might I ask you to just take a few minutes to say a few words on how you are understanding our food system and food crisis in relationship to the horrific war on Ukraine?
It's a perfect example of the dysfunction that occurs when you optimize for high productivity and efficiency, believing that that is a virtue, that that is a net good. But going back to my earlier comments, 1776 was an important year, not just because this nation was founded. It's an important date to everybody who lives in this nation. It's also the year that Adam Smith published the book, The Wealth of Nations, which many folks consider to be the foundation of the economic system that we operate under, and that has been exported to the majority of the world. Soon after the publication of that book, fellow Scottish economist Adam Smith, by the name of David Ricardo, proposed the idea that today we know as comparative advantage. It's the rationalization for globalizing. It's the idea that if in every corner of the planet we all specialize in doing the things that are the best given that particular corner of the planet, the environment, for instance, of that corner of the planet, and then we trade, that then we're all better off. So the idea is Brazil should really be producing the sugar cane. The Midwest and the United States should really be producing the maize. The reason for that, we could go through many examples, but the reason for that is that the geography, the environment, the natural resources, the local knowledge make it so those are the places where we're the best at producing those things, then we can exchange. So we've globalized the world economy and we've linearized it so that there are 7 basins around the planet now that specialize in producing wheat, and they export their surplus. And we've just learned that if you interrupt that particular balance, then people who don't produce wheat for themselves and depend on importing it for one of those basins can't really be proud that they're following this notion of comparative advantage, because they're just going to experience scarcity and hunger. So the way that comparative advantage has actually worked out, it's a very valid concept, but the way that that has actually worked out is that we haven't really traded on the basis of benefiting from one another's the term just cannot be replaced, actual advantages because of geography and because of local knowledge, but rather globalization is operated by finding places where we can exploit people the most, where we don't have protections for workers, and where we can exploit nature the most because we don't protect the environment. Think of deforestation in Brazil, for instance. So those are actually the advantages that are being traded off. So going back to the prior point, what this war is teaching us is that we actually need to invest more in local resilience, in local food sovereignty and stability. And then if in that mode, with those different values of not exploiting other people or nature, there is surplus, then of course it makes sense to trade. That is a very deep learning that, again, is now polite conversation. You've all read the headlines that say, is this the end of globalization? That's the conversation of rethinking the way that premises that actually provide cover for exploitation now need to be examined more carefully. Now, these are all broad philosophical points. We should not forget that those of us that have the luxury of living away from the war zone should not just philosophize. There is a nation of 41 million people right now that's actually suffering from a brutal invasion, the disruption not just of their food system, but of their economic system. Approximately 9% of them are refugees as we speak. They need urgent emergency support right now. But one of the lessons that the rest of us are learning is to think how we can organize our food systems and our socioeconomic systems so that we're not as vulnerable to the global disruptions that occur when that sort of phenomenon occurs. Now, I can't resist just tying one more concept to the conversation here. We are experiencing the result of an invasion that has happened brazenly out in the open. Just the appropriation of land, which is rich in natural resources and rich in agricultural productivity. And if you feel indignant about that, I want to remind you of the history of our own country. You should actually remember what happened in 1846 when the United States did exactly the same thing to Mexico. If you've ever wondered why all of the Southwest has Spanish names and you pretty much need to speak Spanish to tell people where you're traveling in the Southwest of California, that's the reason. Exactly the same phenomenon occurred in 1846. Ulysses S. Grant said later, he was a young officer in the Army, he said later, the president was President Polk, that he was never more ashamed of his country than during that episode. So it's an opportunity for us to reflect on what it took to build the modern economy and to turn away from those sorts of values and live completely different values. This is reflected in the way in which we eat and the effect that we're having on our environment. Because again, if you're indignant about deforestation in Southeast Asia or deforestation in Brazil, then you just need to remember our deforestation was converting the grasslands in the Midwest into row crops. It had exactly the same effect climatically. So there's a lot for us to reflect, but the good news, I'll repeat, is that in the 21st century, we have much better understanding and consciousness about what would be better, so we should do the things that we know are better.
Thank you. So I'm going to come back with one more round of questions, and then all of you should be thinking about the questions that you'd like to ask our panelists. Starting with you, Corby, and I promise I'm going to lend you my microphone again. If you were to leave our audience with one key message, a pearl of wisdom, or even an action item that you think could be powerful and that folks from different backgrounds, different sort of roles, vocations could play, what would it be?
I guess, and does the mic work now?
Yeah.
Yes, magically fixed thanks to your inspiration. It would be never assume anything about the way your food was raised or the people who produced it without looking into it. So things I'm very hopeful about are a move away from beef and animal agriculture toward plant-based food. This is very important right now, especially to young people. And indeed, moving away from cattle, especially beef, will greatly reduce methane emissions, because as we all know, cattle are like a country after China and the United States in emissions, and then followed by India. So that's hugely hopeful. Animal welfare. If you are going to have non-plant-based food and you can't wean yourself quite away, look for some kind of proof that this food was produced with care toward animals and toward the people who produced it. Ricardo, I knew you were going to talk about the people who produced food. You put it so much better than I, but it's got to be a part of every buying choice and every eating choice. Who made this? Who produced it in a restaurant? Who served it? How are they all being treated? And how are the animals being treated?
Super. And can you give us a little peek behind the curtain? You're such an extraordinary writer. You research things so beautifully. what are the issues or topics around food and the food system that you're thinking about and maybe writing about?
It's that. It's animal welfare. It's people. We had a deep dive at Food and Society at the Aspen Institute. We created Safety First, which was the definitive guide, if I may say so, to COVID safety and food service workers. And we released it with Jose Andres, the World Central Kitchen, and James Beard, and the National Restaurant Association, and the Independent Restaurant Coalition. And we got to understand more about who is really looking after their workers and their fellow staff. How do we keep them safe? How now, in the face of lifting mask mandates and vaccination requirements, do we care about each other and our families and the most vulnerable among us? How does that play out every day? So I think making people aware of that, trying to raise awareness of that, and throughout the food service industry is something I'm deeply concerned about.
Fantastic, thank you. Alice, same question to you.
Well, the first thing that came to mind was plant a victory garden. And I say that because I did that during the pandemic. I dug up my front yard and I put a sign there, and I thought I wasn't going to be able to get enough salad and herbs. And so that's what I planted there. But what I learned was incredible, because people ask me questions. What do you plant that the deer don't like? What's easy to grow? How do you make that? And I want to do that too. And I think of, the guerrilla gardener, Ron Finley in Los Angeles, who took over that piece of land that's owned by the government between the street and the sidewalk. And he started planting food. And he got cited for this. And he went to court and he won the case. And so there's a lot of slogans that come back to me from the 60s. And one of them is question authority. And the other one is think globally, act locally. And I think that it's possible to support the people who come to the farmers market, to get to know them. They need your help. And of course, community-supported agriculture is maybe the best way to get to know the producers that are locally around. And that is a very special relationship, which is the kind that I would like to see happen in the schools. It's not farm to school, it's school to farm, where you want to take care of the people who feed you, all of them. You want to take care of the farm workers too, and to bring kids from the school out to the farm. But it's a different kind of relationship. It's not asking something from the farmer, it's giving something to the people who give to you. So I think that connection is the most tasty. No, it's the most delicious. And I mean that in all ways. It's the most gratifying for me to get to know the people who feed me. They're an amazing group of people, and they've enriched my life. And coming to the table, eating together, as I say at the end of my manifesto, we are what we eat. All it takes is lighting a candle at the table to celebrate that ritual of being together.
Thank you. Wonderful. Dr. Salvador.
Well, the Union of Concerned Scientists advocates for changes in federal policy, so you all know what I'm going to say. The rules of the game are basically policy. There are many practices in agriculture, all the way from crops that we're growing or modes of producing livestock that would not be viable unless they were subtended by federal policy. In other words, economically, they wouldn't work on their own. Ecologically, they wouldn't work on their own. But federal policy put in place to support the people that have asked the government to support a particular way of operating or particular business models actually enables things that otherwise don't make sense to be practiced. And so changing the rules of the game, meaning changing the laws so that we can have better values and better outcomes for everybody across the entire food system and a planet that's livable for all of us, that should be the objective of federal agricultural policy. So we normally do not see ourselves invested in federal policy. At the risk of repeating myself, one of the outcomes of the disruptions in the food system over the past couple of years is that rather than just being self-satisfied with the ostensive efficiencies of our modern food system, we realize that there are things that we need to rethink. So those should be conveyed to your federal policymakers. Rather than just being sated and satisfied that we live in the Nike food system, you just eat it and don't have to think about how it's produced, what it takes to do that, we actually should know that each one of us has a stake in speaking to legislators who use federal tax dollars in order to prop up the agricultural and food system that otherwise would not stand up on its own. Now, there are specific vehicles for doing that. One of the most prominent vehicles is a farm bill that's reauthorized every 5 years. The conversation is hot and heavy in this town right now around the reauthorization that is due at the end of the federal fiscal year in September of next year. This is the time for your legislators to understand that they no longer have to hear just from the agribusiness sector, which is where the majority of the food system resides. It does a lot of the work that I described to you earlier, but that there are eaters and communities and institutions that have a different vision of the food system who want their tax dollars to support a different kind of a food system, and therefore that the rules need to be changed. So that is one recommendation that would make a huge difference. Your legislators will definitely take note that they're no longer hearing just from one set of players. And by the way, I'm not saying they are not important. The agribusiness sector needs to be at the table having part in this conversation. It's just that people that normally don't see themselves in federal food policy need to make their voices heard. So that would be the single most important thing that I'd ask all of us to take part in.
Great. And it would be fair to say that if the audience has further questions about how they might get involved in that type of localized advocacy, that they can come to the website, read your blog, and et cetera. Yes. Wonderful. All right, folks, it's your turn. Really do want to invite anyone up to the microphone to ask questions. And I see someone over here. Please do say your name and an affiliation if you'd like, and state your question.
Yeah, I'm Pam Hess. I'm the Executive Director of the Arcadia Center for Sustainable Food and Agriculture. Low-till, going to no-till, among other things. Corby, my Food Access Director, is applying for the fellowship. Look out for Samantha Pounder's name.
Drum up applicants.
Alice, if you like Say Lou, you should check out 1-8 Distilling Company here in town. They are 100% organic, 100% local grain, and the farmer, are you ready?
It's what she's carrying.
Right, the farmer at 1-8 Distilling Company helps other farmers in the region transform into organic farmers so that he can buy their grain, so creating an economic impetus for them. Ricardo, here's the question. USDA, I guess, is seeking comments on these regional food business centers now. And I'm wondering if you can talk to us about that and what your hopes are for that, if it's going to have any impact. Because, of course, the problem that Johanna, you sort of laid out is that we have all the technology and the knowledge to be able to do this. We're up against an economic system that, as Ricardo has talked about, favors global and international and, low price and efficiency at all other costs. So what are the structures that are going to be able to change that? Maybe you could give us like the 10-point plan that we can go to Congress on and say, here's what we want instead.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Fantastic question.
Thank you, Pam. So what Pam has just referred is that there's there is new money that is a result of the American Rescue Plan that the Department of Agriculture is making available to create a parallel or alternative structure to the domestic food system than the one that got us into trouble during the pandemic. And they're doing that by encouraging folks that don't currently have a stake in the current system to put together their alternative systems and to make a proposal to the USDA about how they would set that up on a regional basis. So this is fantastic for a number of different reasons. First of all, this is a different way of operating than we have ever seen out of USDA that normally automatically just identifies with the agribusiness sector because they see that as the food system. But this is another example of what we've just been discussing, that the pandemic made us aware that if we just depend on that highly linear system, then we're all very vulnerable to its disruptions. Let me make just a little parenthetic comment here. There is an engineer at the University of Illinois, Megan Konar, who coincidentally, without knowing that a pandemic was in our future, 3 years ago published an analysis of food flows in the United States. She mapped where the large volume of food was originating and where it was ended up, and essentially ended up observing that our system was so vulnerable that if you actually had a nefarious intention, if you were a terrorist and actually wanted to disrupt the food security of the United States of America, there were just 3 things that you needed to do. You needed to bomb the port of Los Angeles, you needed to take out about 5 bridges on I-80, east-west across the nation, and you need to bomb locks 45 and 21 on the Mississippi River. If you did that, the food system of the United States would essentially be rent asunder. Now, we could rebuild that up, but we would essentially be facing a crisis in the short term, and no food system ought to be that vulnerable. You know, the entire country would be affected by that sort of disruption. Now, coming back to the question, the pandemic also demonstrated to us that the degree of monopoly concentration in the agribusiness sector is so high that these folks essentially can just profiteer when the rest of us are utterly dependent on them to deliver the food that they produce for us, basically reduced to just 4 or 5 major firms in each of the major sectors of the food system. The rest of us have nothing that we can do about that because the Adam Smith principle of all of us being better served when buyers and sellers with free choice and with transparent access to information compete with each other, ostensibly we all are better off. When you have a highly concentrated business sector in any arena, you're not going to have the benefit of that. In other words, we don't have capitalism, we have monopoly. And so that actually allows profit taking. So we've seen that happen during the pandemic. Now, the Secretary of Agriculture is quite limited in terms of what he can do with his authority in terms of dealing with monopoly, but he's doing the next best thing. That's the purview of the Department of Justice. But he's doing the next best thing, which is making these resources available so that we do have more competition. That's what the funds that Pam just described are intended to do. Now, there's issues about that, but we're not going to nitpick it because this is incremental change. This is the direction that we want the Department of Agriculture to be going. But just so that you're aware of it, there is this rule in federal funding. If you don't use the funding, sometimes you can lose it. And there's already a rescission being talked about for funds that haven't been expended from the American Rescue Plan. So the USDA is trying to send out big chunks of money. You need to be able to have a business plan and the organization around you to be able to use, say, $10 million chunks of money at a time. So that means that if you're thinking at a much smaller scale than could use $10 million effectively, then you're really not visible to this particular program. So we just need to note that, and to their credit, the USDA is very receptive to that. We understand why they're doing that. They understand why that's a concern. And so you at least can have a conversation with them. So directionally, this is the thing to do. Now, so that's just a very high level. Pam, thanks for the question.
Super. Sir.
Hi, I'm Kemming, and a food consumer. Years ago, there was an attempt to certify organic foods, and there, I think, was criticism that there was no way you really could have enough inspectors, especially overseas, to actually certify organic foods. And I'm wondering if you go to Whole Foods or your local grocery store, can you really be assured that so-called organic foods are organic? And sort of related to that, I know Chef Waters, one of your friends, Nora Pouillon, was a pioneer in the Washington area, and I'm just wondering if you've kept in touch with her since she retired and what she's up to. Maybe are you doing something together?
Super. So a question on organics and certification, and a question about a colleague of yours, Alice.
Nora Pouillon.
It's extremely hard to understand what the certification means for food that comes in from other countries. Absolutely. And normally we find out that the people who are bringing it in are doing their own certification. So I am looking, that's why I'm always asking, where does this come from? Who certified that? And being from California, we have a very high certification for organic. And when the when the government made certification, it was not as high, and it was a really hard time we had to push the government to be more specific about it. And we really need now a definition for regenerative, too, because that's a word that's being thrown around. And it really can be something that it's so valuable for our health and for climate, and we really need to define it well from the government on down, and not the other way around, not the dilution that happens around these certifications. But it's, you know, it's a big deception when you go into a supermarket. I try never to go into a supermarket. Is that a couple things are organic at the front, and you assume that the rest are. They're very clever about all of the things that are in something being under the fold. And so you have to really, that's why getting to know your farmers and producers is so important. And they need your support too. That's why I think we need this edible education in the public schools, and I do think it's the moment where the Department of Agriculture could really make that happen for the public school system.
Thank you, Alice. Corby, Ricardo, anything else on organics that you might like to say or share?
One short thing. The International Organic Food Standards may be deficient. It might be that large companies can muscle in and not treat their workers very well, but it's a floor. It's there. It's a government agreed upon standard. It may be very flawed, but it's there. I wish there were one animal welfare standard that was agreed on, because that's so thorny, and now it's really self-certification. And then if we could get to how workers were treated, we'd be in some kind of utopia. But these are always flawed. They're immensely difficult to enact, but then there's a floor, and there's something there that is a base for everyone to work from.
Thank you. Ricardo?
No, they covered it.
Wonderful. Please.
Hello.
Ooh, hello.
My name is Julie. I actually work for the exhibition, so I've had the pleasure of listening to all of the panel discussions that have happened. And last week, there was one about writing about the environment, and one of the panelists spoke about trying synthetically made meat and milk for the first time. And I guess I was just curious, amongst this group, what are your thoughts about that? As far as like synthetic meat being an option for us moving away from beef and cattle, or is that, I don't know, I just had never heard that that was a thing, so I guess does that make sense?
Thank you for your question.
Okay.
So synthetic meat, synthetic milk, what do you think?
There's a couple of big realms. There's plant-based meat and plant-based milk. And then there are cultivated or cultured, in which they take cells from animals and then reproduce and brew them. So that might be what you mean by synthetic. I think that giving consumers alternatives to the current animal agriculture system is really good. Therefore, I'm very much in favor of plant-based foods. The other cell-cultured and cultivated meats and milks are very much in the experimental phase. We're going to see more and more of them. They'll continue to lose money. They're huge money losers right now. They're not really available. The more alternatives consumers have, the better.
Complimentary or alternative views, Alice?
You can only imagine what I think about that. I believe that food that's nutritious needs that regenerative soil and the sun to feed us. And I also believe that that all of the additives to the food has really caused huge health issues in this country. We can't even begin to unfold that, but we know that the medical system is in favor of all of this because it's just getting us to go to the hospital more frequently. And it's all a big, what do we say, industry. And commodities, that's something I really wanted to say at the end. To think that food could be talked about as a commodity, it's sort of terrifying to me, because food is about life and about health and about beauty and about deep nourishment. And we have to change the language that we use in government when we're talking about food.
Thank you.
And education. Because I just want to say this one last thing, that I feel like our school system has been industrialized, like our farms. So it's kind of going for one size fits all, you know, all sitting in our seats, all learning the same thing. When in fact, we need to get out of the classroom and out into nature, take down the walls around the schools, bring the community in. I think I love Jimmy Carter more than I ever have, because he understands that when we all get together, we can make something happen. And Habitat for Humanity could rebuild all of the schools in this country. And it would be so beautiful. The idea that we get together, and we did that at one school in San Francisco, and I was on the garden detail. Every time I go past that school, I say, I'd help to do that. It's so rewarding. We've lost that sense of we're all in it together. We can all do this. And amen.
Thank you. So folks, we have 3 minutes left, and I actually see some questions. Let me ask anyone who has a question to step up to the mic. We're going to ask them quickly all together, and then any of our panelists can respond, and then we will call this a wrap. So please.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Morgan McKinney, and I'm a Bill Emerson National Hunger Fellow here in DC right now. And my question is really related to your point, Alice, just thinking about the true cost of food and also thinking about food not as a commodity. Unfortunately, we know sustainably, locally sourced food is the best for the environment, but that's very inaccessible to so many low-income communities. And so I'm just wondering what your suggestions are for scaling things that are happening in local areas like the school, a project that you spoke about, Alice. How do we scale those things, and or what other policy changes have to be enacted to make sure that low-income communities are not being left behind in this movement, and creating a better food system that doesn't see food as a commodity?
Thank you. So a question about scale, moving from a commodification of food, and a justice angle, right? Question over here.
Yeah, thank you all so much for this amazing conversation. I'm Darren Carr, I work at Bread for the World, which is a coalition of 150,000 Christians that advocate to end hunger, and I do our climate work as well, so it's really great to have this conversation. I wanted to know, we're expecting the president's next budget for fiscal year FY23 to come out very soon. And, as we all have heard many times, budgets are moral documents. So I wanted to hear, what are you looking for to be funded in this next bill? And, what should we be paying attention to? Thank you.
Super, thank you. And I'm going to let you guys pick the question you want to respond to. Quickly over here.
Hi, I'm Susan Meiseles. I'm actually co-curator of the show, so I'm thrilled that you're here, and all of you. My question goes back to Ricardo, which goes to the essence of globalization and this intertwined nature that you spoke of. And thinking about the CNN images and thinking about the headlines we're reading and knowing that the Ukrainian farmers are not planting wheat and how that's going to impact North Africa. But my real question is the DOA speaking the DOD? Since we seem to be more interested in sending weapons and what is going to happen to the whole food system internationally, it may not affect us, our wheat, but are they in conversation? Polite conversation. I loved your term, polite conversation in DC. But do they talk? Because these are so interrelated. The war efforts and the food that we won't see, etc. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. Susan, the visionary of this entire exhibit. Fantastic. And last question over here.
Hi, my name's Kilvio. Sorry. So, Corby, you kind of touched on this, how like the younger generation is very passionate, and I feel like that always comes up in conversations surrounding climate change. And so I guess I'm just curious why you think other past generations weren't as passionate about climate change and food and sustainability, and why it took so long for this to take center stage.
Super, thank you. Corby had lifted up the power of the engine of sort of youth leaders and youth action in the climate movement, the food movement, and a question about sort of why now and why haven't generations prior been as engaged in the issues.
Read Alice's memoir about the free speech movement. They had a lot on their minds. So there was the Vietnam War, there was the kind of international expansionism that was a direct following of the Mexican incursion that the US did that Ricardo talked about. There are always causes that galvanize young people. And in a previous generation, it was Vietnam. Right now, it's climate change also because we are so on the verge of the point of no return. This is such a crucial moment that this is where young people feel they must make a difference. They have no choice. Just as when they were watching their fellow college students get drafted and killed as cannon fodder, they had to do something. Right now, I feel that there's an urgency that is bringing together people your age, and so get going.
Thank you.
Well, I just read this manifesto called We Are What We Eat, and I was trying to understand what had happened to us as a nation between World War II and now. And that phrase of Priyat Savaran, the destiny of nations depends on how we nourish ourselves, came to mind. And I thought about the indoctrination that has gone on from fast food to, from the 50s to now. And we have not just eaten the food that may not be good for us, but we've eaten the values, digested the values that come along with the food. So more is better. Time is money. Everything should be available 24/7. Food should be fast, cheap, and easy. It's never been fast, cheap, or easy since the beginning of civilization. That it's okay to eat in your car. And it's okay to waste because there's always more where that came from. So we are in that place where we've accepted that. And we think food that's organic is too expensive. And again, these are myths. It's not true. And when you start to cook for yourself, you realize that it's a great pleasure. It's not a hardship. And they tell you that agriculture, farming, is hardship, and cooking, it takes too much time, when in fact, those are such pleasurable, gratifying activities that have been around since the beginning of civilization. So,
Thank you, Alice. Ricardo, last word.
No. So, yeah. Yeah. So here, military strategists, first of all, understand the importance of food security for peace. And they see that as the domain of government. The military is an instrument of government. So the military strategists have an interest in good government that maintains stability so that all the other activities, including food production, can take place. So at that level, they think about that. Now, the Department of Defense, this may seem like we're going astray, but it is the largest food procurer in the nation. So in order to be military ready, they need to have vast supply chains of preserved food so that they can field the standing army in any part of the world at any given notice. If you're following the news, Russia is failing on that count in terms of supporting their invading army. So in that sense, the Department of Defense does think a lot about food as well. Alice has referenced fast food. Probably people don't have much need to know, but our concept of fast food actually originated with the Department of Defense essentially specifying to the food industry what they needed in order to be able to set up the supply lines to support their standing armies in the field in the Second World War. K rations were essentially the precursors of today's fast food. C rations, those sorts of things. So in that sense, they think about it. And actually, they have been open to many food-related conversations in the domestic sense, all the way from the fact that they have an interest in the nation having a much healthier food supply because we're such an unhealthy population as a result of the way that we eat that they're not able to have enough healthy recruits. They can't accept all the people that that volunteer to be part of the Army because they're not physically fit enough in order to be able to be part of the Army. So in that sense, they think about it, and there are allies in terms of advocating for a healthier food supply. So there's potential for inroads there, but the strategic question that you're asking, that type of conversation they see outside of their domain. But one aspect of your question that I think is important, maybe the best way to end a coal and ice discussion panel, is that the war is forcing a decision point in terms of our fossil fuel-based economy. In one sense, it's a trumped-up conversation, but in one sense, it is a very real conversation. It affects all sectors of the economy, our petroleum addiction, and it is responsible for human-induced climate change, the biggest lever that there's been for that. So because that fossil fuel supply has been compromised out of Russia, and because it's experiences higher prices by wealthy nations, Those that have an interest in the petroeconomy are doubling down and saying, see, what we need to do is to develop alternative fossil fuel resources elsewhere. We need to double down and never be vulnerable to Russia doing this to us again. And of course, that means let's accelerate planetary warming because of what Russia did. Let's just ignore what the consequences are going to be environmentally, without realizing there are perfectly good alternatives. Ignoring that, we've developed the alternatives to power ourselves, to transport ourselves, to feed ourselves. So that's what we actually need to be investing in. So that's the question that the war is calling for all of us to act on right now. So if any of us have any say in any venue where we can render an opinion that will shift the direction in where we're going, we should all argue for steering away from the fossil fuel-based economy, that's what the lesson of the Russia disruption is. Rather than doubling down on that, double down on the alternatives. Let's go through the transition. Let's accelerate that.
So this conversation has really lifted up the interconnections, the systemic change that's necessary to transform our food systems. And when you look around, you can see the complexity and the severity and the urgency of what's at stake. In that context, it can feel really humbling and sometimes debilitating about what we can do as individuals. But each of you and all the people that you've touched have really shown us that taking a visionary sort of effort forward with others can really make a difference. I want to really invite all of you to join me in thanking Ricardo, Alice, and Corby. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Johanna.
Thanks, everyone, for coming and for all of your work.